I've got a problem with cutting my pottery in half, and it's usually for good reason, but I wanted to show you all the steps leading up to these decisions. Let's make a vase with 7 pounds of clay. Pottery, like most things, the more volume, the more weight, doubling your recipe, it's just going to be harder to have control. So the comparison of throwing something with 1 pound versus 7 pounds is vast. I'd be lying by saying having some upper body strength doesn't help, because you're definitely going to be leaning and putting all your weight into the centering portion of this. By far the hardest part of throwing any pot is just getting it on center. But once you have it on center, the rest of the steps, the pulling, the shaping, the compressing with a rib, should be a lot easier. Now that I've got this thing all coned up, I'll just push down into the center of the wheel and cone it back down onto center and go for this little cap shape. Then I can get the clay nice and wet and puncture my fingers through the middle, opening it up, and after this I can start my pulling process. It might look a little rough around the edges on the base there, but I'll go back through with my sponge just to compress the bottom and make sure it's not going to get any cracks while it's drying. We're just about ready for our first pull, and I try not to pull up too much clay at once because I have so much clay in my hands. The harder that I press them together, the more likely I'm going to throw this thing off center or take out a huge chunk of clay. So I just try to have it as even as possible so I can wet the sides of it and start collaring that clay into a cone shape. I'm working towards having my clay towards the center of the wheel the entire time, because once it starts to bow outwards, it's just going to want to go outwards and turn into a bowl. You'll notice throughout this entire process I'm repeating a lot of the same steps, at least for the throwing of the cylinder part before I get into the shaping. I'm getting the clay really wet on the outside and the inside so I don't have any resistance while I'm pulling up the clay. By pinching my fingers together, having a nice steady pace of the wheel, and moving my hands at the same speed as the wheel's rotating. The idea there is that if you stop in one place for too long or you pause while you're mid-pull, you'll have a thin spot in your pot because you're pinching your fingers together that much harder in one spot versus moving it up in one consistent speed. And you don't want any thin spots. It will be the demise of your pot. So as we did earlier, we do our pull, then we wet the sides, and we collar in by squeezing our hands together and lifting up. Maintaining that cone shape throughout the entire process, at least throughout the pulling of the cylinder. All good shapes of pots start with cylinders because that's the most important foundation we can have. A key part when you're throwing any pot, large or small, is having stability and some support. Since this cylinder's gotten really tall, I gotta stand up, I can no longer use my upper body as much, and I have to brace my right arm on my leg. This helps give me that stability and support that I need so I don't throw my pot off center while I'm doing a big pull. And now I've pretty much got the height that I desire, so I can start shaping out the pot. The walls feel pretty thin. It feels like I don't have to get much more height out of this thing. I can just start pushing out with my inside hand and belling out the form. So during this whole process of pulling up the cylinder, I've been putting water on the inside wall so my fingers don't stick, and I need to go back in there with my sponge and get all that water out because we don't want a soggy base, because that's going to make our pot crack. After all that, we can come back with our metal rib and continue to belly out this pot, and at the same time compress the walls and get all that slip off of the outside to give it more strength. The amount of slip that's become built up on the outside wall is really apparent right here that I'm scraping off my rib. So the next handful of, shaping with this rib kind of motion that I'm doing is really repetitive. It honestly takes me the longest time because I'm trying to get a really round belly and perfect that form. Hence me speeding up the video a little bit. You'll notice how much clay I left at the top of this vase, and that's for good reason. I try to leave a decent amount so I can keep pulling it up after I've shaped out my belly. I don't want to go back to that bottom section. It's all good down there. I'm not going to touch it. I'm just going to continue to pull up this top part and collar it in so I can get a nice narrow neck without destroying that, roundness that I've worked for. Inevitably, each time that I collar in the pot, I'm going to kind of sink in the shape a little bit, so I'll go back in with my fingers and my rib and push from the inside out to give it that nice smooth curve. We've just about wrapped this thing up. I'm just using my finger to delicately give a nice angle and arch to that rim, a nice flare, if you will. These are how I like to make my vases. It's how I've made them for a long time. And I think it's just a really lovely kind of classic shape. And there's the pot. It's all done. Who's to say if I'll keep it or not? If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. And like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you. Bye.